What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks into what should be a routine morning talk show appearance, only to find himself facing the most disrespectful interrogation of his career? What happens when years of professionalism collide with blatant disregard and condescension? Today we're diving into the explosive confrontation that had Samuel L. Jackson walking off the View set, leaving Joy Behar speechless and the entire studio in complete shock. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me which talk show host you think handles interviews the best. Trust me, after you hear what happened here, you'll have some strong opinions. Samuel L. Jackson had been doing the interview circuit for his latest film, and everything had been going smoothly. The seasoned actor known for his commanding presence, both on-screen and off, had fielded the usual questions about his career, his craft, and his upcoming projects with his characteristic wit and charm. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold on The View. The morning started like any other. Jackson arrived at the studio early, went through hair and makeup, and chatted casually with the production staff. Everyone who worked with him knew he was a consummate professional, someone who took his craft seriously, but never forgot to treat people with respect. The crew loved working with him because despite his intimidating screen presence, he was genuinely kind and approachable. "Mr. Jackson, we're ready for you," the stage manager announced, gesturing toward the familiar set where the hosts were already seated. Jackson straightened his jacket, took a deep breath, and walked onto the set with the confident stride that had made him one of the most recognizable actors in the world. The audience erupted in applause as he made his entrance. Jackson smiled and waved, clearly comfortable in front of the cameras. He'd done this dance hundreds of times before. Talk shows were just part of the business, a way to connect with fans and promote his work. He settled into the guest chair, adjusted his microphone, and prepared for what he assumed would be another pleasant conversation. "We're here with the incredible Samuel L. Jackson," Whoopi Goldberg announced to the audience, her warm smile genuine. "Samuel, thank you so much for being here with us today." "Thank you for having me," Jackson replied, his deep voice carrying that familiar authority that audiences had come to love. "Always a pleasure to be on The View." The other hosts smiled and nodded, clearly excited to have such a legendary figure at their table. But as Jackson scanned the panel, he noticed something in Joy Behar's expression that seemed different. There was a sharpness there, an edge that made him slightly wary. Still, he maintained his professional demeanor. "So, let's talk about your new film," Sunani host began, leaning forward with genuine interest. "You've been in the business for decades now. What keeps you passionate about acting?" Jackson's eyes lit up as he began to discuss his craft. "You know, every role teaches me something new. Even after all these years, I'm still discovering new ways to tell stories, new ways to connect with audiences. This latest project really challenged me because that's fascinating." Joy Behar interrupted suddenly, her tone sharp and dismissive. "But let's talk about something more relevant. Don't you think at your age, you should be considering retirement?" The question hung in the air like a slap. The other hosts exchanged uncomfortable glances and Jackson's smile faltered slightly. The audience fell silent, sensing the sudden shift in the room's energy. "Excuse me," Jackson said, his voice maintaining its composure but with a slight edge creeping in. "I mean, you're what, 75 now?" Joy continued, completely ignoring the obvious discomfort she'd created. "Isn't it time to step aside and let younger actors have their moment? Hollywood is changing, and maybe it's time for the older generation to accept that their time has passed." The other hosts looked mortified. Whoopi tried to jump in. "Joy, I don't think that's no." Joy waved her off dismissively. "I think it's a fair question. The industry is evolving and we need fresh faces, new perspectives. Samuel, surely you can see that hanging on too long just becomes embarrassing." Samuel L. Jackson sat back in his chair, processing what he just heard. In his decades-long career, he'd faced criticism, tough questions, and challenging interviews. But never had he encountered such blatant disrespect disguised as journalism. His jaw tightened slightly, and those who knew him well would have recognized the warning signs. "Let me make sure I understand you correctly," Jackson said slowly, his voice becoming dangerously calm. "You're suggesting that I, as a 75-year-old man who has worked in this industry for over 4 decades, should retire because I'm too old?" "Well, when you put it that way, it sounds harsh," Joy replied with a dismissive laugh. "But yes, essentially. I mean, how many more action movies can you realistically make? Don't you think audiences are getting tired of seeing the same old faces?" The tension in the studio was palpable. Camera operators adjusted their positions, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. The audience members looked at each other in disbelief, unable to process the level of disrespect they were witnessing. The same old faces, Jackson repeated, his voice getting quieter, which anyone who knew him understood was far more dangerous than if he'd started yelling. Joy, let me ask you something. How long have you been on this show? Joy Behar, seemingly oblivious to the storm she was creating, puffed up with pride. 24 years, and I'm proud of every one of them. 24 years? Jackson nodded slowly. And you're what, 81 years old? But somehow my age is the problem here. Joy's face re-ended slightly, but instead of backing down, she doubled down on her position. That's completely different. Television hosts don't have the same physical demands as action stars. We rely on our wit and intelligence, not our ability to run around and shoot guns. Jackson's eyes narrowed. The man who had commanded respect in boardrooms and on film sets around the world was witnessing something he'd rarely encountered in his professional life. Blatant hypocrisy wrapped in condescension. So you're saying that what I do requires no intelligence, no wit, no craft? Jackson asked, his voice still eerily calm. That I'm just some old man running around shooting guns. The other hosts were desperately trying to signal to Joy to stop, but she was too caught up in her own perceived cleverness to notice. Well, let's be honest about what action movies are, Samuel. They're not exactly Shakespeare, are they? That was the moment everyone in the studio knew Joy Behar had crossed a line from which there was no return. Samuel L. Jackson leaned forward in his chair, and for the first time since the interview began, his famous intensity wasn't an act. The man who had brought characters like Jules Winfield and Nick Fury to life was about to deliver a performance that none of the hosts would ever forget. Not Shakespeare, Jackson repeated, his voice dropping to that low, measured tone that had made him famous. Joy, let me educate you about something since you seem to think you know so much about my profession. Joy Behar, still completely oblivious to the gravity of the situation, smirked. Oh, please enlighten me. I've performed Shakespeare, Jackson said, each word deliberate and precise. I've done a King Lear and Macbeth on Broadway. I studied at Morehouse College and earned my degree in dramatic arts. I spent years in theater before I ever stepped foot on a movie set. But you wouldn't know that, would you? The smirk began to fade from Joy's face, but she wasn't done digging her hole deeper. Well, that's ancient history. What have you done lately that requires any real acting skill? The other hosts looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. Whoopi Goldberg herself, an accomplished actress, was visibly cringing at her colleagues' behavior. Sarah Haynes had her head in her hands, and Sunani Host was frantically trying to get the attention of the producers off stage. Ancient history. Jackson nodded, his voice growing more dangerous with each passing second. So my Tony Award nomination means nothing. My Academy Award nomination means nothing. The fact that I've worked with directors like Spike Lee, Quentin Tarantino, and Martin Scorsese means nothing because Joy Behar has decided my career is irrelevant. Look, I'm not trying to diminish your past achievements, Joy said, though her tone suggested exactly that. I'm just saying that maybe it's time to be realistic about your current place in Hollywood. Jackson stood up suddenly, his full height making him an imposing figure over the seated panel. The studio fell completely silent except for the hum of the cameras. My current place in Hollywood? Joy, let me tell you about my current place in Hollywood. He began pacing behind his chair, his movements controlled but filled with barely contained energy. Last year, I was in 3 films that collectively grossed over $800 million worldwide. This year, I have 4 projects in various stages of production. Directors are calling me, not the other way around. Studios are writing roles specifically for me. But according to you, I should step aside. Joy tried to interrupt, but Jackson held up a hand that commanded silence with an authority she'd never possessed. No, you wanted to have this conversation, so let's have it. You want to talk about being realistic. Let's talk about the reality that you've been on the show for 24 years. And in all that time, what exactly have you contributed to the world of entertainment besides divisive comments and manufactured controversy? The audience was completely captivated. They'd come expecting a typical morning show interview, and instead were witnessing one of the most powerful actors of his generation dismantling a talk show host with surgical precision. I've been a voice for important issues, Joy protested weakly. A voice for important issues, Jackson repeated mockingly. Like telling a working actor that he should retire because you've decided he's too old. Like dismissing decades of craft and commitment because you think you know better. That's your important contribution. Whoopi finally found her voice. Samuel, maybe we should take a breath. And no, Whoopi, Jackson said, turning to face her directly. I respect you. You're a talented actress, comedian, and host. You've earned your place at this table through decades of hard work and genuine talent. But this, he gestured toward Joy. This is exactly what's wrong with media today. He turned back to Joy, who was now looking decidedly uncomfortable for the first time in the interview. You sit behind this desk every morning and pass judgment on people whose shoes you couldn't walk in for 5 minutes. You make pronouncements about industries you've never worked in, about crafts you've never studied, about people whose accomplishments dwarf anything you've ever achieved. Now wait just a minute. Joy tried to regain her composure. I've been in entertainment longer than you have. I was doing stand-up comedy when you were still. When I was still what? Jackson challenged. When I was still struggling with addiction and pulling my life together. When I was still fighting for every role I could get. When I was still proving myself every single day, instead of sitting comfortably behind a desk making ignorant comments about people who are still out there doing the work. The personal revelation hung in the air. Jackson had rarely spoken publicly about his past struggles, and the fact that he was bringing them up now showed just how deeply Joy's comments had affected him. You want to know the difference between us, Joy? Jackson continued, his voice now filled with a cold fury that was somehow more intimidating than if he'd been shouting. I've spent 50 years perfecting my craft. I've studied under the best teachers, worked with the most talented directors, and challenged myself with every single role. You've spent 24 years reading cue cards and giving your opinion on things you don't understand. Joy's face was now bright red, and she was clearly flustered. You can't talk to me like that. This is my show. Your show, Jackson laughed, but there was no humor in it. This is The View, not the Joy Behar show, and even if it were, that wouldn't give you the right to be disrespectful to your guests. But here's the thing that really bothers me about people like you. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the desk and looking directly into Joy's eyes. You think that because you have a platform, you have wisdom. You think that because you have a microphone, your opinions matter more than anyone else's. You've confused having a job with having authority. The studio was so quiet that the sound of the air conditioning was audible. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath, recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Let me tell you what real authority looks like, Jackson continued, straightening up to his full height again. Real authority comes from mastering your craft. It comes from decades of continuous learning, from taking risks, from failing and getting back up and trying again. Real authority comes from earning the respect of your peers through excellence, not by tearing down others from behind a desk. Joy tried one more time to regain control of the situation. I think you're being overly sensitive. I was just asking legitimate questions about the industry. Jackson shook his head slowly. Overly sensitive there at Island. The classic response when someone gets called out for being disrespectful. It's not that you were wrong, it's that I'm too sensitive to handle your legitimate questions. He began walking toward the edge of the stage, but he wasn't done talking. You know what a legitimate question would have been, Joy? You could have asked me about my new film, about working with the director, about the challenges of the role. You could have asked about my foundation work, about my advocacy for literacy programs, about the scholarships I've funded for young actors. The other hosts were now openly uncomfortable, knowing that their colleague had created a situation that was spiraling completely out of control. But instead, Jackson continued, now standing at the edge of the stage, you chose to question my right to continue working. You chose to dismiss my entire body of work as mindless action movies. You chose to suggest that I'm too old and irrelevant to deserve respect. Jackson turned back to face the panel one final time, his expression a mixture of disappointment and resolve. You know what the saddest part about this whole exchange is, Joy? It's that you represent everything that's wrong with how we treat people in this business and in this country. Joy, now visibly shaken but still trying to maintain some semblance of control, attempted to respond. I think you're making this into something much bigger than what? Jackson interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. Much bigger than a talk show host telling a guest that he's too old to work. Much bigger than dismissing someone's life's work as meaningless. Much bigger than the kind of ageism that destroys careers and crushes spirits every single day. He walked back toward the desk, but this time his approach felt different, more final. Let me explain something to you about respect, since you clearly don't understand the concept. Respect isn't something you get automatically because you have a television show. Respect is something you earn through how you treat other people. Whoopi tried desperately to salvage the situation. Samuel, I think what Joy was trying to say was, "No, Whoopi," Jackson said firmly but kindly, "don't make excuses for her." What Joy was trying to say was exactly what she said. She thinks I'm too old, too irrelevant, and too past my prime to deserve basic human courtesy. Joy finally found her voice again, but her tone had lost all of its earlier smugness. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Jackson looked at her with something approaching pity. "That's exactly what you meant. And the fact that you can't even own it now shows that you don't have the courage of your convictions. You want to insult people, but you don't want to face the consequences of your words." He pulled out his phone and held it up. "You know what I'm going to do when I leave here? I'm going to call my agent and confirm the 3 film offers I have sitting on my desk. Then I'm going to call the director of my next project to discuss the character work we're doing. After that, I'm going to review the script for the Broadway play I'm considering for next year." Joy's face had gone from red to pale, and she was clearly struggling to find a response. "But before I do any of that," Jackson continued, "I'm going to do something that you apparently never learned how to do. I'm going to think carefully about how my words affect other people. Because unlike you, I understand that with a platform comes responsibility." He began removing his microphone, his movements deliberate and final. "You see, Joy, the difference between us isn't age. It isn't even talent, though we both know how that comparison would end. The difference is character." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Even the production crew had stopped moving, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. "You had the opportunity today to have a meaningful conversation with someone who has dedicated his life to his craft," Jackson said, carefully placing his microphone on the desk. "You could have learned something. Your audience could have learned something. Instead, you chose to be small, petty, and disrespectful." Joy made one last desperate attempt to defend herself. "I was just trying to have an honest conversation about the realities of Hollywood." Jackson stopped and looked at her with genuine disbelief. "Honest? You want to talk about honesty? Here's some honesty for you. In my 50 years in this business, I've met thousands of people. Actors, directors, producers, writers, crew members. And in all that time, I've rarely encountered someone with as little self-awareness as you've displayed here today." He straightened his jacket and looked around the studio one more time. "You know what the real tragedy is? There are young actors watching this show right now who looked up to you. There are older performers who respected your longevity in the business, and you just showed all of them that success in television doesn't require wisdom, kindness, or even basic human decency." Sonny host finally found her voice. "Samuel, please let's not end things like this." Jackson turned to her with a sad smile. "Sonny, I'm not ending anything. I'm simply refusing to participate in it. There's a difference between having difficult conversations and being deliberately cruel. What happened here today was cruelty disguised as journalism." Joy tried one more time, her voice now noticeably smaller. "Samuel, if I offended you, that wasn't my intention." "If you offended me," Jackson repeated incredulously. "Joy, let me be crystal clear about something. You didn't offend me. You revealed who you are, and that revelation has nothing to do with me and everything to do with you." He began walking toward the exit, but turned back for one final statement. "You know what I find most disturbing about this entire exchange? It's not that you think I'm too old to work. Plenty of people have opinions about age in Hollywood, and that's a legitimate discussion to have. What disturbs me is the glee with which you delivered those opinions." The studio was so quiet that every footstep echoed as he moved closer to the exit. "You enjoyed trying to diminish me. You took pleasure in attempting to make me feel small. And that tells me everything I need to know about your character." Joy was now visibly upset, but Jackson wasn't finished. "The entertainment industry has its flaws. God knows. But it's also given me the opportunity to work with some of the most talented, generous, and inspiring people I've ever met. People who lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. People who understand that success is sweeter when it's shared." He paused at the edge of the stage and looked back at the panel. "I hope someday you learn the difference between being provocative and being cruel. I hope you learn that asking tough questions and being disrespectful aren't the same thing. And I hope you learn that the power that comes with a platform should be used to elevate people, not diminish them." With that, Samuel L. Jackson walked off the view stage, leaving behind a stunned studio audience and a panel of hosts who knew they had just witnessed something unprecedented. Joy Behar sat in her chair, speechless for perhaps the first time in her career, while the other hosts struggled to find words to fill the uncomfortable silence. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of the aftermath as one of Hollywood's most respected actors chose dignity over confrontation and walked away from what had started as a routine interview and ended as a masterclass in grace under pressure. As Jackson disappeared from view, the audience slowly began to process what they had just witnessed. Not the explosive confrontation they might have expected, but something far more powerful. A demonstration of what true class looks like when faced with inexcusable behavior. The silence that followed his exit spoke louder than any argument could have. It was the silence of people recognizing they had just watched someone take the high road while simultaneously delivering one of the most devastating takedowns in television history. What did you think of this incredible confrontation? Have you ever seen a celebrity handle disrespect with such power and grace? Subscribe to the channel and comment below with your thoughts on how Samuel L. Jackson handled this situation. Do you think he was right to walk away?